Hello, good day to you. It is April 2nd, I believe. It's hard to know what day it is anymore. I'm going to continue reading on with Knowing Jesus by James Allison and singing a song at the end. Just wanted to highlight one of the reasons I think this perspective is so important regarding having the intelligence of the victim, being able to tell the story from the perspective of the victim, namely Jesus in this case. And then also the revelation that Jesus in some way reveals that our societies and religions are built on exclusions and sacrificing people. The reason I think that's important is what I heard in the news today about over in Moorhead. There was a fellow who went to the grocery store and he decided to cough on a number of the workers there on purpose, and those workers happened to be an African American and an Asian American, and he had some comments that followed regarding how minorities are the reason why this virus is happening, and it was his goal to cough on them, to scare them into thinking that he was trying to get them sick and get rid of them. And so we need to think again and again about how we are prone to getting rid of those people that we think are a problem because we think it'll make everything better, um, and to show how, in many ways, our whole way of operating, our cultures are formed on that kind of a premise. That's kind of the thrust of this book. And here we're going to finish the chapter today, I believe. However, Jesus could not protect his disciples from what he knew would be the ultimate scandal, his forthcoming lynching. Of course, he warned them on every possible occasion, producing heavy reactions from Peter, which were indicative of Peter's having been scandalized. On the one hand, God forbid, Lord, this should never happen to you. And on the other, even though they all fall away, I will not. Peter first denied that the scandal would happen, thus making himself a stumbling block to Jesus. And then, when he saw that a time of trial would come, he promised not to be scandalized by it. This was a promise that his following would not be interrupted by it, a promise which he couldn't deliver. Jesus knew that no one would be able to follow him through the scandal of a death which must inevitably seem a failure, because it was written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. What he gave the disciples on his resurrection, therefore, was the ability to follow him without death being a stumbling block. There was nothing left that might cause his disciples to stumble. Death was swallowed up in a victory. Now see what this led them to understand. It led them to understand that all stumbling blocks, all relationships where people are locked in with each other as stumbling blocks, where imitation and learning is distorted by rivalry, are related to death. The presence to them of the crucified and risen Lord was what enabled them to learn to imitate pacifically, having the deepest bonds of their relationships, which were cast in modes of stumbling, loosed, so that they might no longer live towards death, but instead live with death as an incidental side issue. Again, it is the intelligence of the victim given after the resurrection that enables them to see the whole of this healing process of discipleship in its light. It is this which enables them to see the point of the very mysterious utterance in John's Gospel. It is to your advantage that I go away, for if I do not go away, the Counselor will not come to you, but if I go, I will send him to you. The suggestion here is that Jesus could, as a human being present with the disciples, teach them only so much. He could teach them many elements of following him. They could become authentic imitators of him, doing the works he did, just as he did the works of his Father, by his perfect imitation of him. That is, Jesus could exercise a certain sort of trance-like hold upon his disciples. But it could only go so far. There were two things militating against the imitation being complete, the possession being full. The first was that Jesus was a human being like his disciples, and therefore was other to them as any human being is to another, and thus not able to move them completely as his Father was. The Father is other than each one of us on a completely different level than us. He can thus move our freedoms, our will, and our intellect without displacing them, as humans do to each other when we teach, command, bully, or attract each other. Jesus, because he was a human being, could not, at least until he was killed, completely possess his disciples. The second reason that the disciples' imitation of Jesus could not be complete while he was still alive was that in any human relation, the knowledge that death will supervene, will separate, is an ultimate factor, one that cannot be bypassed. There is always in any human relationship of dedication an element of the provisional because of the certainty of death. We are all, rightly, suspicious of leaders or whoever who exercise the ability to command loyalty even to death. This is because it is usually the death of the followers that is involved, not that of the commander. So there is a certain stumbling block to a perfect imitation posed by the simple fact of being a human this side of death. This was removed by the resurrection. The presence of the crucified and risen Lord made available the possibility of a perfect human imitation of Jesus, because it made available an imitation without the stumbling block of death. And with the possibility of the possession of the disciple by Jesus at the level of freedom. That is to say, after the period of Jesus' physical appearances, he was no longer other to the disciples, as we are to each other, but was other only in the way that God is, beyond the possibility of rivalry, who moves us from within to will and to work. For the first time, a human imitation became possible that need have no element of rivalry. In the light of this, it is possible to see how the disciples came to understand the relationship between the stumbling block of Jesus' death, which had been a stumbling block for them until it was overcome by the resurrection, and all the stumbling blocks which humans put in each other's way. Precisely because we desire to be, to live, we cannot imitate each other pacifically, and thus learn from each other, but always have to get ahead so as to avoid death. So we cannot be gratuitous with each other, but always have to insist on rights, on everyone getting what they deserve, on not doing more than we have to. Our imitation, which is the only way we humans learn, from our tenderest infancy upwards, is always provisional, because we are only doing it for our advantage, which we would quickly use against our teacher if the need arose. And so we guarantee our sense of being by an imitation turned rivalistic, which locks us into all sorts of conflicts. At the bottom of this spiral is death. Ultimately, all our imitation is based on a desire for being, for life, for which we will sacrifice anything, even as far as killing. Of course, we disguise this from ourselves in a variety of ways, but never very convincingly. We need wars. We need starvation in third world countries. We need other people to die so that we can live. Learning to follow Jesus is learning how to receive the gift of life, of being, which we inescapably desire as something given, something which can only be received by a non-rivalistic, a pacific imitation of someone who makes this imitation possible by being beyond death. So the disciples were able to see how they had been slowly summoned out of living in rivalry. Jesus put a small child in their midst to show who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. He insisted that greatness meant following him to death. It meant being amongst others as one who serves. All these measures add up to an ascesis of desire. It is a question of moving human desire out of a pattern of relating to others from rivalry, a relationship based on death, to a relationship based on the pacific imitation of Jesus, leading to a relationship with others of gratuity, service. This is only possible from the security of having received life gratuitously. It is possible to go through the Gospels and see exactly how the intelligence is how this intelligence is omnipresent. On the one hand, there is to be found pacific imitation, avoiding victimization, but making one a candidate for becoming a victim. And on the other hand, rivalistic imitation, leading one to avoid being a victim, but making others one's victims. Just to give one example, one that is not usually quoted under this particular set of circumstances, let us look at John 10 and the discourse about the Good Shepherd. Here you have the sheep following the shepherd, the ultimate picture of non-rivalistic following of of imitation, peaceful imitation. The sheep hear his voice and follow, but what makes him the good shepherd is precisely that he is able to lay down his life for his sheep. That is, it is possible to imitate him beyond death. He does not cause his sheep scandal, as do other shepherds who run away when danger is near. They cannot be safely imitated, but are thieves and hirelings, because they themselves are scandalized by death, which they have not overcome. Between the good shepherd and the sheep there is a connatural knowledge, because there is no stumbling block, no rivalistic imitation. The whole complex of ideas about pacific imitation, the scandal of death being overcome and death being the scandal for others, could not be more tightly expressed than in John 10:27-28. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. And I give them eternal life, and they shall never perish, and no one shall snatch them out of my hand. It's all there. The understanding of discipleship that had been made clear in the light of the risen victim. When Jesus uses the language of shepherd, he is, of course, using for himself one of the titles which Israel reserved for God, the shepherd of Israel. Thus, there is already present the idea that this human person, by permitting this entirely peaceful imitation, is on the same level in relation to us as is God. That is, Jesus is able, by leading us in our imitation, to possess us and move us as God is. He says as much in the next verses. My Father, who has given them to me, is greater than all, and no one is able to snatch them out of the Father's hand. I and the Father are one. It is precisely this assertion that leads the crowd to seek to stone him. That is to say, because people are locked into a stumbling block with relation to each other and to God, they react to the possibility of a completely pacific imitation as to a scandal and seek to lynch it. In this scene, we see brought together with magnificent clarity the two elements of the intelligence of the victim that I've been discussing in this chapter. The intelligence of the victim living towards the knowledge of being lynched, on the one hand, and on the other, the way in which the intelligence of the victim has opened up the understanding of what Jesus was teaching his disciples as to the nature of discipleship, and simultaneously the nature of the world of scandal in which we live, the whole area which a later theology was to call original sin. So let me sum up where we have reached. We looked in the first chapter of Jesus' resurrection. Since then, we've been looking at the intelligence of the victim, which that made possible. In the next chapter, I'd like to look at the way in which the intelligence of the victim went worldwide, because it is that will give us, I hope, the basis of any chance to work out in the final chapter what knowing Jesus might mean today. So some questions to follow this kind of heady reading today is, in what ways do you perceive that our world is built on excluding someone? What ways do you hear today that if only we got rid of this or that kind of person, there would be healing or our life would be better? And then on the flip side, can you think of any stories in real life, in the news, or even in fiction that are told from the perspective of the person who is pushed out, a lynched person, an excluded person? And what can we learn from that way of telling the story? Restore in us, O God, the splendor of your love. Renew your image in our hearts and all our sins remove. O Spirit, waken us, the wonder of your power. From fruitless fear unfurl our lives like springtime bud and flower. Bring us, O Christ, to share the fullness of your joy. Baptize us in the risen life that death cannot destroy. Three-personed God, fulfill the promise promise of your grace, that we, when all our searching ends, may see you face to